to the Tough Fish Show. I am so excited to bring to you Shawn Peters. Shawn, thank you so much for being on the show.
Jen, thank you for having me. This is really exciting, and I've been looking forward to this chat for like a month.
I'm so glad you are here. And I would love for you to start with, how did you get into writing?
So, how I got into writing was by being not quite good enough at acting to make that my career. I always say that both of my parents were writers. My father was a sports writer. My mother was a TV writer, and she wrote on all these amazing sitcoms of the 80s and 90s. And I was not a super rebellious kid per se, but I did know that if both of my parents did something for a living, it couldn't be that cool, right? Like, that's that idea. So I wanted to be an actor, and I worked hard at it. I took acting classes. I grew up in Southern California. My mother did, being a TV writer producer, did not want me to be an actor, so I didn't get the nepotism baby advantages. But when I outgrew it, if you will, I found myself having ideas, and I wanted to write maybe for TV or movies, and I worked towards that, and I didn't get necessarily all my goals. I didn't sell a movie, and I never worked on a TV show that I am super proud of per se, but I became a professional writer. And once you start doing that, you start extending your reach. And so that's what led me to start writing fantasy sports articles and relationship articles for the Boston Globe Sunday magazine. And then I got into being a copywriter for advertising. And then, gosh, at this point, it's almost 9 years ago, I had kids that were middle grade readers, and I was reading them all these amazing books. And as I was reading them, all I could think was, I think I could tell a story like this. And I'd like to write some, even if only my kids ever heard it, I would like to write one of these. So that's what kind of got me into trying to write a book.
Oh, I love how you said that about how writing kind of starting out in one space and you pushed and you found yourself exploring other options. Because my background's journalism. So a technical nonfiction styled writing, if you will. And I did a lot
Mm.
of that in corporate. But, to your point about pushing that, I've always journaled. So that's been like a creative outlet, then picture books, then a nonfiction book. So I get it. I totally understand how you feel about that. So when you decided to try your hand at a middle grade story, how did you start?
Well, I mean, it was interesting. I had tried writing a book before middle grade. Again, really almost more as a writing exercise to see if I could do it or a catharsis. And I wrote a book that no one wanted to read, even myself when I did it read 3 months later. Um, but one of the best notes I got back from somebody that read it and gave me some advice was like, "Well, who's this book for?" And I realized I hadn't thought of that. Like I've been like, well, if there happen to be a lot of people like me, they would like this book, but maybe they aren't. With middle grade, it was much more along the lines of I was reading all these middle grade books to my kids, of course the Harry Potters, of course the Percy Jacksons, but also like books from my childhood. I grew up reading The Great Brain and John D. Fitzgerald, and I read all the Encyclopedia Browns. I loved a lot of Roald Dahl and other stuff. And I realized that I had kind of a soft spot in my heart for that smart, undersized kid because that's who I was at that age. Um, and so as I was reading all these stories, there's a lot of wizards, there were a lot of demigods, there were a lot of spies, but I was a superhero kid growing up. I was a comic book kid, and I wasn't seeing a lot of that. And a lot of times when I get an idea, it's usually two or three things crashing into each other a little bit. So in my mind, I knew that I said, well, there aren't that many superhero stories out. And then I had just seen The Incredibles about a superhero family. And then I was, again, always attracted to the story of that kind of undersized underdog kid. And I said, well, what would happen if there was a kid that had been always felt othered because of various things, who suddenly became part of a superhero family? And by virtue of being the only human, like human in the house, basically, as opposed to superhuman, suddenly was the most typical person in his family. So he went from, living this othered life to being kind of the most normal person in the household. And that's what kind of came together for me. And I was like, I think there are kids that would like that story. And I really thought about the picture of the kids that I thought would like that story. And the rest of it came together pretty quickly once I had kind of that North Star.
Okay, you have hit on a few things. First off, you mentioned really you got a form of feedback that
Hmm.
you figured out if it was the right type of feedback to take on and then how to take it on. And on top of it, you really dug a bit deeper with, okay, who is this reader in particular? And let the story kind of come together a little bit and start working from it from that angle, not still necessarily writing only just to not to sell a book, but
Hmm.
just necessarily now I know how to get the right point of view, have the right kind of dialogue, have the right kind of elements going into the story, the right kind of plot. So those pieces kind of help to shape because of getting clear of who the reader you wanted, thus the character and those other parts. Am I on the page with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, as I said, I was an actor, and so you don't really get to choose who your audience is when you act, right? Whoever pays for a ticket and all that. But I think that when you're writing, you always would, even though you would like as many people as possible to read your book and enjoy it, you have to think about, like, if you could only put this book into the hands of one person, who would it be? And I had, the voice of Logan is very closely tied to one of my best friend's sons. And at the time, our families were outrageously close, spending every weekend together, traveling together, all kinds of stuff. And he's on the autism spectrum. I mean, he's now an engineer, but at the time he was, a 12, 13-year-old kid. And we spent all this time, and he had a very particular way of speaking. And I had kind of like I'm going to say avuncular. I was like an uncle to him, right? And I learned, as he was growing up from 6, 7, 8, 9, I was like, I have to shift how I talk with him because his mind works differently than mine. And it's important to me to have this authentic relationship with him. But there were just little quirks of his speech patterns that found their way into Logan. And when people say that Logan's voice is special, I say, well, this is the value of listening, right? This is the value of, you know, actually finding things in the world and listening to them and observing them and letting them permeate you. And then there's something about it when you push that back out through your art that hopefully resonates with people, because it doesn't feel like it just came from your brain. It came from a place.
It came from your heart. I mean,
Yeah.
to me, that's really where it's coming from because you can hear all the
Mhm.
sounds, but listening is something deeper. It's really synthesizing that and your response is coming, like you said, from a different place, which
Mhm.
is still another form of feedback because you're
Yes.
really getting that information, you're doing something with it, and then you're responding, not just reacting, you're responding. And what I'm hearing is that what I'm listening to is that Logan, this character, it really helped to shape his point of view. Like he became a very strong character because
Mhm.
he had a lot of dimension to him.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I do, you know, I think of big plots, I think of stories that I want to tell, but my process is very much one, and it's self-taught. I did not go through an MFA process. I don't even know that I've technically taken an official creative writing class in my life. Um, but I've always written things. And I when I write these books, I do an outline. I start with like a 2 or 3 page synopsis, which I turn into like a 14-page outline that goes chapter by chapter. And then the reward for me for doing all that hard work of plotting and making sure that all the beats are there, and I'm not going to write myself into a corner where a character is either irredeemable or the situation can't be done, is I get to go and I get to live as the characters and write as them, right? I get to write dialogue and I get to write what they're thinking. And for me, that's like going back to acting, because I get to go back and play every character in my book. And I think that even really ties back into why I wrote Middle Grade. As we discussed it, reading middle grade to my kids, I got to be all the characters, right? I would do a different voice for everyone. And it was something that my kids loved and something that I loved. So this is an extension of that. And the actual act of drafting is getting to play all the characters I've worked so hard to build. And then they get to surprise me
Y-
because
Yeah, yeah. So to your point with leveraging the acting and developing your character, I mean, I can see how that would take shape with, the physicality and the body language. Is this character, how much
mm-hmm,
space they're taking up? Are they gesturing? Are
mm-hmm.
they, are they clenching their fists? What expression might be on their faces? I can see how all of those would come into play. How did you leverage it with dialogue?
So I did a lot of improv in my life. And so, you know, basically all acting and especially improv is knowing what your character wants and then how are they going to get it. And also going back to something we talked about earlier, listening, right? A lot of my dialogue comes from knowing that this character has to say this thing, and then not necessarily knowing beforehand what the other character is going to reply, but basically putting myself in the character's skin and saying, what would they say to that? Like, not just what would they say to the emotion of what they've been said, but like have them listen to the words that came out of the other characters' mouths. And yeah, it's all happening on the page, but it's all happening between my ears in this, theater of the mind first. And that theater of the mind does go into, what keeps you from just writing dialogue, dialogue, dialogue is you actually think like, what would happen to this character's skin hearing that? Would they get goosebumps? Would they flop sweat? Would they suddenly feel itchy? You know what I mean? Like these are all choices you would make as the actor playing that character. But now I get to make those choices, and then I don't have to get it right the first time. I can look at it, I can go back and reread it and go, that itchy thing. I think kids are gonna think that he's got a rash, not that he's uncomfortable. I'm gonna change that.
Okay, so you just hit on something else with that, which is allowing yourself to write whatever comes through, however it came through, and
Mm-hmm.
recognizing that you can go back with edits, the power of edits that
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Which is, we've talked a little bit about feedback. When you act, you get immediate feedback. The reason is there's an audience, right? In the moment. When you write, feedback comes a lot slower, and the first person that feeds back is yourself. And when I go to schools and I talk to kids, and the teachers, like, they all kind of do this from the background because they're happy I'm saying it. I'm like, the first draft of everything is terrible. The question they always ask is, how long did it take you to write the book? And then I proceed to tell them, well, I started writing in 2014 and the book came out in 2022. So it takes a while. But yeah, you're your own feedback first, but then you have to get outside feedback. And this is something that I think you and I have in common, having worked in the corporate world as well as writing, is I got my first formal feedback training in the corporate world. We actually had something like a feedback champions group where we learned about feedback, giving better feedback, how to take it, and getting people to see feedback as a gift. And that's that idea that, like, it is a gift because it's something someone gives to you to help you achieve what you're trying to achieve. And that's why it's different. Feedback and critique aren't always necessarily the same thing, right? Critique is somebody that may not have been asked for it coming to you and just telling you what they didn't like. And that is feedback, but it's not necessarily the most useful feedback. But as a writer, and now I use this as a manager of people in my corporate job. I use this as an author when I go to schools and I talk to the teachers after my presentations. I seek out feedback because I understand that feedback is the only way my work can get better in a way that I cannot yet see, right? I would never write something and be like, this is crummy. I like it. I liked what I wrote for a reason, but somebody else's perspective is the only way I'm going to find out whether that is a universal or a common, everybody feels the same way about it, or that's just how I felt about it at the moment. So yes, viewing feedback as a gift. And that's something that I've had to find out myself, again, because I didn't go through an MFA and I'm not part of a writers group. So I didn't come up having all those beta readers and critique partners and all those things. You have to find people that are invested in your success or the success of your work, whose opinions you believe, and then ask them to really help you get better. And if you can change that mindset from, oh God, what if I show it to them and they don't like it, to I I need to show it to them and I hope they find some things that aren't working so we can get better. Like that mindset change is what unlocks not only the work, but also it's an anxiety reliever. It takes away a source.
Yeah, the comment of being open to it and allowing it to help you make it better. I remember one of my editing clients, and I sent back the first round of edits to him as a developmental editor, so reading for structure and content and stuff. And so when I sent it back, and he goes, well, I agree with 98% of what you said. And I said, and I'm glad you disagreed with 2%, because I want it, this is your story. This is your book. I want you to be successful. I very much care about you being successful, but it's still your story. And because you disagree with it, that there's some elements you do, that is a good thing, because that's going to help strengthen your piece overall, not just because you agreed with other suggestions. That's helpful too. But the disagreement also helps you to strengthen, because you're then looking back and saying, do I agree? Does this really resonate with me to change my vision or to change the direction of this book or this particular section, this scene, this story, this message, or what have you? Or do I just need to make a few tweaks to get the point across? That's kind of what I'm hearing.
Yeah. It's so funny. I talk a good game about feedback, right? But when I got my first edit letter, like after I sold the book and I got my first edit letter from Dave Linker, my editor for the Logan Foster books, I had a freak out. I had that like freshman freak out, right? And I literally called uh her name's Julie Abbott Clark. We went to high school together, but um I called her because she had published a couple of books and she was like totally different books, but she had kind of been my like Sherpa of like guiding me through the process. And she was like, yeah, have a drink, calm down. You're supposed to freak out about this. And then I realized, and she helped me take a step back. And now what I have done every time I've gotten an edit letter since then, every time I get a critique partner or a beta reader stuff, is I take what they've given me and I actually go note by note and I color code them. And I literally I pull out the highlighter tool in Word or in Google Docs, and I put a green over anything I totally get and understand, and totally orange is things that I'm like, I'm not sure I totally agree and I might need some clarification. And red is stuff that like I inherently disagree with, 24 hours after I've read it, basically. And it's amazing because when I started doing that, I had the exact 98% experience where I was like, wow, of this 3 pages, there's only 5 things that aren't green. 3 of them are orange and 2 of them are red. And I'm like, this is probably not as bad as I think it was. But I focused on the fact that like they want this to happen or they aren't buying this relationship. That's the key to this whole thing. What am I doing? And that once you actually give yourself that like visual cue to see how much of there is actually helping you right away and how much of it probably is you just need a little more clarification, suddenly you go, yeah, well, let's spend some time on these couple of reds and let's figure out if it's your understanding of it that isn't matching mine, or if you understand it the same way as I do and you're not digging it, because those are really different things. Um, and put our effort on those places because the rest of these are just going to make it better and better and better.
I love the color coding idea. I think that's cool. And I love that you talked about a distance too, because you've read it, you took some space, you color coded, and still probably took some space to go, I'm going to work them in order. I'm going to work them in my color coding order in some ways, because if I've already bought into those changes, they might not necessarily be easy to do because you still have to restructure or rethink things, but at least you bought into them to know that you agree, so you have something to work on. You want to. The orange takes a little bit more work, but you still bought in. The red is coming back to going, okay, I've had more distance. Now what do I do with this? And
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that I've had clients when they've given me a draft go, I am so scared to hear what you're going to say, or you sent me back some stuff and there's all these notes or what have you. And I'm like, look at it this way. When you get feedback from an editor that you trust, when you get feedback from that person that you've asked for feedback because you trust that they have your back and they give you something, know that they see something solid to work with, and it's about strengthening that message. And when you are giving that feedback and you're focused on being kind and constructive, that they're both there, then your heart is coming from the right place as you're delivering that information. And the person receiving it can also go, even if I marked it red, I
Mm-hmm.
know the intention from this person. And even if I need to go back and say, hey, can we talk this out a little bit? I'm still trying to get my head around how to work this, because I can't tell if you dig it, or we're just not on the
Yeah.
same page, or if there's really something missing and I'm just not understanding. But you can have that conversation because you've had that understanding going in.
Right. Yeah, and that's that feedback is a gift idea, that yes, you can get feedback from people that aren't invested in your success, and sometimes it's valuable and sometimes it's not. But if you know a person's invested in your success, if you know that the person that's saying this isn't secretly hoping that you fall flat because they want your job or something like that, right? Then you can decide to do with the feedback what you want to. But they're saying, I think you're trying to get this result. And I think that in these ways, you may not be getting the result. And I'm seeing this from the outside. And it is something, it is a gift that you cannot give yourself. Like, short of being able to, wipe your brain and read your own work fresh for the first time, it is impossible, because every page you read has all the scratch. Like, you still remember what you originally wrote, and you may have cut those lines out, but somehow that is infused in it. um my writing process tends to be, I don't, I'm not one of those 5,000, 10,000 words in a day people. I try to find time before my day job and sometimes afterwards and see if I can knock out between 400 and 800 words during the week, and then on the weekends I try to get another 3,000 words between the 2 days, and that seems sustainable and still have a life. But one of the things that keeps me from writing faster is that when I sit down, I read whatever I wrote the day before, the previous session, and I do a light edit on it, because I discover things, everything from the paltry, like, oh, I repeated the word hand 3 times in this paragraph. Let me do better than that. But then there's also like, oh boy, I don't. That's not what it was. But what the wonderful thing of that is, it keeps you from being too precious when you're actually drafting, because you know that you're going to revisit it tomorrow and you have a chance tomorrow to make it better. And in that drafting process, and one of the most common questions I get from students is, "Do you ever get writer's block?" And my answer to that is not really, because I don't expect what I'm writing to be perfect. So I'm okay. Like, I don't feel great after a session where I've written 1,000 words and am not a fan of them, but I feel better than I would have if I had sat all day writing no words until the perfect ones came. And that most writer's block, I believe, from the way people have described it to me, it comes from the belief that I can't write anything if I don't think it's perfect. And I don't have that expectation of myself. The work comes from putting the words down when you know they're not perfect. And yeah, so that doesn't frighten me. and I guess there's another kind of writer's block, which is I'm out of ideas, but that has never been an issue for me. I am somebody that not saying that they're all good ideas, but I'm constantly having ideas. And that's actually how I knew that middle grade books was kind of a place I wanted to be, because back when I was trying to write screenplays, I would have screenplay ideas all the time. And I think I wrote about a half dozen screenplays and got close, had a couple of them optioned, but not made into movies. And then once I stopped pursuing that, I went for a long time where I didn't have ideas like that came to me unbidden, you know? And then once I started writing middle grade books, I started having more ideas. And I was like, okay, this is a sign that I'm in a place where there's fertile ground, and just keep digging, and you're gonna keep hitting new stuff.
Oh, I love that. So, Shawn, to your point about, feedback and taking it on, or discerning that it's not the right one to do or what have you, and then continuing, how do you know when that manuscript is now truly ready to move forward into its next phase?
Mm.
Because you can sit there and polish that stone for a long time, and sometimes there's that, a lot of times it's that inner knowing that says, okay, it is, we need to, but it can be an easy dance to go, oh, but what if,
Mm.
oh, but what if.
Yeah.
What do you recommend?
Well, so I think there are different types of people in the world, right? Like there are people that believe perfection is somehow attainable, and feel like they have to get as close to it as possible before something can go out. And then I think there are people that know that they have taken something as far as they can take it in the moment. I don't think The Unforgettable Logan Foster and The Unforgettable Logan Foster and The Shadow of Doubt are perfect books. If somebody said, "Hey, you want to go back and tweak some stuff now?" I know that I could, but I don't want to. Like, I'm really satisfied. I'm proud of how they are. When I read them back, I used an Audible credit last week or last month to listen to my book for the first time. Matt Braver does a wonderful job voicing all the characters and such. And as I was listening, I fell into my own story. I
Oh,
didn't, I wasn't sitting there going, man, I didn't nail that conversation, did I? I fell into it. I was able to appreciate it, and hearing it in someone else's voice allowed me to do that.
I love
So, so to my mind, I think that once you take this kind of, it has to be perfect before it can blank. If you're like, this is an iterative process, and at a certain point, I'm going to feel good enough about it that I feel like the world can see it and make their decision, that's the kind of internal thing. And then I also think that it, like, when you have that next idea that's knocking on the door, that's great. When it's pounding on the door, then it's time. And
that.
so and if the thing you're working on right now is no longer pounding, send it out, get feedback, find out. And if the feedback that comes back is it's still not ready, then maybe it goes in a drawer for a little while and you can come back to it when it starts pounding on the door. But if you get a bunch of people, other authors or the intended audience, because I'm a big believer in the intended audience. In fact, I should probably tell you a little story about that too. But if they come back and they say, this is great, take yes for an answer. Like, there's okay to say, I know I could probably make it a little bit better, but people are liking it. Let's let's put it out on, it's roadworthy. Let's see how far it can go. And just what I said about the target audience, I'm so fortunate. So before I ever was a published author, my wife at the time was teaching fifth grade, which is the perfect age for my books. And so I had been revising and trying to find an agent for about 2.5, 3 years. And she said, could I read it in class with my students? And I was like, that'd be so cool. And then she's like, and then you can come in and do an author visit and they can talk to you. And I'm like, yes. And secretly I'm thinking, and I can get market research. Right. So I went in and I talked to 100 fifth graders about my book 3 years before it actually came out, a year before it was agented. And they told me things about my book that made me go back and do one more revision that changed it, Didn't change the plot, but it changed some of the perspectives. And I don't think the book sells without it.
I love that. I love that so much. I
So
think
yeah.
that's fantastic.
So
So
now when I write for this age group, one of the things I do is I use my network to at least get some kids to read it. A lot of them don't have a life lived experience to give me like great feedback, like tight feedback like you would from a critique partner, but you can at least get a sense from them like what's working and what might not be working and what are the things that stick out to them and are they getting the message you're hoping to get across.
absolutely. Oh my goodness. I love that so much, Shawn. This has been amazing. Where can people connect with you and where can they get your books, Shawn?
Absolutely. So my website is ShawnPetersWrites.com. I'm not always great about updating my events, but most of my events, frankly, are at schools these days. But anytime I have something that the public can come to, like I maybe do something, actually, by the time this airs, I hopefully will have just done something at Patriot Place in Massachusetts. Um, so that's a great place to start. I'm on Twitter at Shawn Tweeters. Please feel free to hate me for being called Shawn Tweeters, but that was the name I picked when like Twitter was a week old. And I was like, oh, that's funny. Shawn Peters, Shawn Tweeters. And here we are, more than a decade later. And I'm like, I can't believe that's the name. Um, yeah, so I'm on there. I'm also at Shawn Tweeters on Instagram. And those are all awesome places to catch up with me. And you can buy my books almost anywhere. So they're on Amazon, they're on Barnes and Nobles. But obviously, if you have a local indie, what I have learned, one of the true things I've learned in the 2 years I've been a published author at this point is that independent booksellers are kind of the best people on the planet. And if you have the time to go in and say, do you have The Unforgettable Logan Foster? The answer almost always will either be yes, and we're so happy to sell it to you, or we can get it for you within a week. And it means the world to them and to your community because your community gets something from having booksellers, local booksellers who are putting books in people's hands and making the community a little more literate.
Shawn, thank you so much. This has been a blast.
Thank you, Jen, for having me and continued success. This has been so much fun for me as well.